This week isn't just big, it's game-changing. General Hospital.
The night Marco died, the air over General Hospital seemed to shift in a way that no one could quite explain. It wasn't just the storm gathering over Windmere or the distant echo of thunder rolling across the black water, like a warning too late to hear. It was something quieter, something heavier, a feeling that slipped into the spaces between words, between breaths, between heartbeats. Because Marco wasn't supposed to die that night. The moment that broke everything. Lucas Jones had always believed, perhaps stubbornly, perhaps foolishly, that even in a town like Port Charles, where danger lurked behind every corner, love could still arrive unannounced and stay longer than expected. Marco had felt like that kind of love. Not perfect, not fully understood, but real. And real was rare. That's why when Lucas, portrayed by Hansis, stood in that dimly lit corridor, his hands trembling, his voice cracking against the weight of what was unfolding, something inside him had already begun to fracture. The future he'd barely dared to imagine was slipping away in front of him. And he couldn't stop it. Blood, silence, and the end of almost. Marco's final moments weren't grand. There was no heroic speech, no last-minute miracle. Just blood, too much of it, spreading across fabric, across skin, across possibility. And silence. The kind that follows a truth too cruel to argue with. Sidwell stood frozen nearby, unable, or unwilling, to fully process what had just happened. His world operated on control, on calculation. But this wasn't part of the plan. Nothing about Marco's death felt planned. It felt stolen. Lucas dropped to his knees, his hands pressing desperately against a wound that wouldn't close, as if sheer will could reverse what had already begun. "Stay with me," he whispered. But Marco's eyes were already drifting somewhere Lucas couldn't follow. And in that moment, everything that could have been, every laugh not yet shared, every fight not yet resolved, every quiet morning not yet lived, collapsed into nothing. When a story stops mid-sentence. Back behind the scenes, Hansis would later describe the moment he learned that Adrian Anchondo was leaving. Heartbreaking. Not just for the narrative, but for the human connection behind it. "I was really, really sad," he admitted. And it wasn't the kind of sadness that fades quickly. It lingered. It stayed. Because Marco wasn't just a character to Lucas. And Adrian wasn't just a co-star to Van. There's a strange alchemy that happens on a set like General Hospital. Lines blur. Emotions deepen. What begins as scripted interaction evolves into something far more personal. So when Hansis stood there, delivering goodbye lines meant for Lucas, part of him was also saying goodbye to Adrian. And that kind of farewell doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. Windmere, the place where it all fell apart. By the time the storyline moved to Windmere, there was already a sense, unspoken but undeniable, that something was coming. Danger had been circling for days. The tension had been building, tightening like a wire pulled too far. Hansis himself had sensed it. Someone wasn't going to make it out. But knowing that doesn't soften the blow. Because when the moment arrives, it doesn't feel inevitable. It feels wrong. Marco could have been anyone else's loss. Someone else's tragedy. But instead, he became Lucas's. And that made all the difference. Grief isn't the end. It's the beginning of fallout. What makes Marco's death linger isn't just the way it happened. It's what happens after. Because grief in Port Charles is never contained. It spreads. It seeps into everything. It reshapes people in ways they don't immediately recognize. For Lucas, grief wasn't clean. It wasn't a quiet mourning followed by gradual healing. It was tangled, messy, complicated by guilt. Because he had let himself believe. He had gone all in, fast, fearless, without hesitation. He had trusted that what he was building with Marco was something real, something lasting. And now, that certainty haunted him. What if he had seen the danger sooner? What if he had said something differently, acted differently, loved differently? The questions didn't have answers, but they refused to stay silent, watching it happen twice. One of the most haunting details Hansis shared was that he watched Marco's death play out on the studio's internal monitors as it was being filmed. Not once, but twice. First as Lucas, living it, feeling it, breaking inside it. Then again as Van, observing it from a distance, yet somehow feeling it even more deeply. It was visceral and scary, he said. But more than that, it was heartbreaking, because watching someone die, even in fiction, carries a strange emotional weight. You know it's not real, but the feelings are. And sometimes that's enough. Sidwell, a man unraveling. While Lucas collapsed inward, Sidwell began to unravel outward. Marco's death wasn't just a loss. It was a disruption. A fracture in the carefully constructed world he relied on. Control had always been his shield. Now it was slipping. And in that loss of control, something darker began to emerge. Regret. Not the kind that seeks forgiveness, but the kind that festers, that twists, that demands resolution no matter the cost. Marco's death wasn't the end of Sidwell's story. It was the ignition point, the ripple effect across Port Charles. In a town like Port Charles, no tragedy exists in isolation. Marco's death sent ripples outward, touching lives that hadn't even intersected with his directly. Whispers spread, questions followed, and with every retelling, the story shifted slightly, growing heavier, more complicated. Because people weren't just reacting to what happened. They were reacting to what it meant. If Marco could die like that, suddenly, brutally, without warning, then no one was safe. And that kind of fear changes people. Lucas, living in the aftermath. For Lucas, the days that followed blurred together. Time didn't move normally anymore. Moments stretched too long or vanished too quickly. Sleep came in fragments, and waking up felt like stepping back into a nightmare that hadn't ended. He found himself replaying everything, every conversation, every glance, every touch, searching for something he had missed, something that could explain why this happened. But grief doesn't offer explanations. It offers echoes, and Lucas was surrounded by them. Love that didn't get its ending. What made Marco's death especially cruel wasn't just that he died. It was that his story with Lucas had barely begun. There was still so much left unsaid. So much left undone. And that unfinished feeling lingered like a wound that refused to close. Because closure requires time. And time was the one thing they didn't get. Behind the scenes, beyond the script. For Van Hansis, the experience wasn't just another storyline. It was a reminder of how deeply connected actors can become, not just to their characters, but to each other. Saying goodbye to Adrian Anchondo wasn't just professional. It was personal, and that authenticity bled into every frame of those final scenes. That's why they felt so real, because they were. The story moves on, but it doesn't forget. In daytime drama, stories rarely end. They evolve. shift, transform into something new. But some moments leave a mark that doesn't fade. Marco's death is one of those moments. It doesn't just live in the past. It shapes the future. Lucas will carry it forward in every decision, every hesitation, every attempt to open his heart again. Sidwell will carry it too, in ways that may not yet be fully visible. And Port Charles? It will continue spinning, as it always does, but just slightly off balance. The echo that remains. Long after the storm passed, long after the blood was washed away, something remained. An absence. A silence. A space where Marco should have been. And in that space, the echoes lingered. Of laughter that never came. Of love that never fully had the chance to exist. Of a story that ended too soon. Because Marco didn't just die on General Hospital. He was torn out of it. And the aftermath? It's still unfolding.